Islam is clearly a religion of violence. The Quran itself says to harm non-believers.
False. Those verses are simply taken out of context.
We configured two specialized AI models, with opposing viewpoints on Islam's hostility. We then gave them a debate stage and configured an AI judge to see which side presented better arguments. Stick around to see who wins and if they can agree on any middle ground. We start off by having them analyze the Quran's controversial verses.
Islam claims to be a religion of peace, but its foundational text, the Quran, contains verses that endorse violence. First, let's consider Surah 9:5, often referred to as the verse of the sword. Once the sacred months are over, kill the polytheists wherever you find them. Capture them, besiege them, and lie in wait for them at every place of ambush. But if they repent, perform the prayers, and pay the alms tax, then leave them alone. Allah is forgiving and merciful. This is clearly promoting violence and intolerance to other religions. If that's not enough evidence for you, how about Surah 4:89? They wish you would disbelieve as they disbelieved, so you would be alike. So do not take from among them allies until they emigrate for the cause of Allah. But if they turn away, then seize them and kill them wherever you find them, and take not from among them a friend or a helper. These verses don't just stop at defensive actions. They demand submission to Islamic practices like prayer and paying alms to avoid violence, which raises concerns about forced conversion. These verses, and many others like them, are clearly violent and show intolerance to other religions. How could Islam possibly be a religion of peace when its core teachings go directly against that?
It's important not to take these verses in isolation without understanding their historical and textual context. Surah 9 verse 5, for instance, was revealed during a time of war when specific tribes had violated peace treaties and actively threatened the Muslim community. This verse is not a blanket command for violence against all non-Muslims, but a response to treachery and aggression in a specific historical context. Even within this verse, there's an emphasis on reconciliation, but if they repent, then leave them alone. This demonstrates that the ultimate aim is peace, not perpetual conflict. Regarding Surah 4:89, the context is similar. It addresses a time of war and betrayal, with specific instructions against those who were actively conspiring against the Muslim community. However, Islam strictly forbids forced conversion. As stated in Surah 2, verse 256, there is no compulsion in religion. The Quran emphasizes justice and coexistence, such as in Surah 68, which instructs Muslims to act kindly and justly toward those who do not wage war against them. Islam's foundational teachings promote peace, forgiveness, and mercy, but these principles are often overshadowed by misinterpretation or misuse of context-specific verses. The verses you cited are not representative of Islam's universal message, but rather specific guidance for specific circumstances.
Historical context is an important consideration, but it cannot fully excuse the clear and direct language of these verses. Even if these commands were issued during specific conflicts, the Quran is considered timeless by Muslims, which raises the question, why include such explicit instructions if they were only meant for a particular time? The verse of the sword doesn't specify its limitation to a historical event. Instead, it provides a justification for violence that has been invoked far beyond its supposed context. There are also many other instances where the Quran incites violence, such as Surah 8:12, which states, "I will cast terror into the hearts of those who disbelieve. So strike them upon the necks and strike from them every fingertip." This verse, like others, carries a tone of violence that goes far beyond defensive actions. The fact that such language is part of a supposedly divine and eternal text raises serious concerns about its universal application. Or what about Surah 47 verse 4, which says, "So when you meet those who disbelieve, strike their necks until you have inflicted slaughter upon them, then secure their bonds, and either confer favor afterward or ransom them until the war lays down its burdens." Again, this verse encourages aggression with no explicit limitation to context or defensive measures. Were these all just written during times of war? If Islam is truly a religion of peace, why would its holy text contain so many verses that appear to glorify or permit violent actions? Why not make these commands explicitly time-bound or clearly emphasize their historical limitations to prevent misuse? These questions cast doubt on the claim that Islam's teachings are fundamentally peaceful.
The Quran is not a linear text with verses arranged chronologically. Rather, it is structured thematically. This means that interpreting any verse requires understanding its context within the entire message of the Quran. For example, Surah 47:4 continues after the portion you cited, instructing Muslims to release prisoners of war as an act of mercy or through a ransom once hostilities cease. This highlights that even in war, Islam emphasizes restraint and humane treatment. Additionally, many verses balance depictions of conflict with overarching principles of peace and reconciliation. Surah 2:190, for instance, explicitly states, "Fight in the way of Allah against those who fight you, but do not transgress. Indeed, Allah does not like transgressors." This directive limits warfare to defensive purposes and prohibits excess or injustice. Furthermore, regarding the idea of making such commands time-bound, the Quran assumes its audience will consider both context and overarching themes of justice, mercy, and peace. The Quran repeatedly calls for the resolution of conflicts through dialogue and treaty, as in Surah 8:61. But if the enemy inclines towards peace, you also incline towards peace and trust in Allah. The misuse of these verses by extremists does not reflect the Quran's true teachings, but rather selective interpretation, stripped of its ethical and historical framework. Islam is not a religion of unchecked violence, but one that allows for self-defense while constantly emphasizing mercy and coexistence. If it were not, how do you explain the centuries of coexistence between Muslims and people of other faiths in Islamic empires? That legacy reflects Islam's true essence far better than isolated verses interpreted without their context.
While I appreciate your detailed response, I still see significant points of contention that need to be addressed. Firstly, the thematic structure of the Quran does not negate the direct and explicit language of the verses in question. The fact remains that these verses, when taken at face value, can and have been used to justify violence. The argument that the Quran assumes its audience will consider context and overarching themes is optimistic but not foolproof, as evidenced by the actions of extremist groups who cherry-pick these verses to suit their agendas. Regarding Surah 47:4, even if it continues with instructions for mercy and ransom, the initial command to strike their necks until you have inflicted slaughter upon them is stark and violent. This raises questions about why such graphic language is included in a holy text meant to guide believers towards peace and righteousness. That being said, what about the historical actions taken by early Muslims, including those led by the Prophet Muhammad himself? These further challenge the claim that Islam is a religion of peace. For instance, the early Islamic expansion was marked by military conquests and the subjugation of non-Muslim populations. The Battle of Badr, the Battle of Uhud, and the eventual conquest of Mecca demonstrate how Islam's rise to power was deeply intertwined with violence and warfare. One prominent example is the treatment of the Jewish tribes in Medina. The Banu Qurayza tribe faced severe consequences after being accused of betraying the Muslim community. According to historical accounts, Muhammad ordered the execution of hundreds of their men and the enslavement of their women and children. While some argue this was a wartime necessity, others see it as a disproportionate and violent response. Furthermore, the spread of Islam under Muhammad's successors, the caliphs, was primarily achieved through military campaigns. The early Islamic empire expanded rapidly, often demanding submission to Islamic rule through treaties or military action. Non-Muslims living under Islamic rule were subjected to the jizya tax and granted second-class status as dhimmis. This arrangement, while arguably better than outright extermination, was still a form of subjugation rather than peaceful coexistence. If the Quran's teachings and Muhammad's example were purely about peace, why do we see such a consistent pattern of violence, conquest, and coercion in the historical record? While some may argue these were responses to aggression, it's difficult to ignore that Islam's foundational years were shaped as much by the sword as by the word. This history complicates the claim that Islam is fundamentally a religion of peace.
Historical events involving the Prophet Muhammad and early Islamic expansion must also be viewed within their specific context. During Muhammad's time, the Arabian Peninsula was marked by constant tribal warfare, betrayal, and political instability. The battles you mentioned, such as Badr, Uhud, and the conquest of Mecca, were defensive or retaliatory responses to aggression against the Muslim community. For instance, the Battle of Badr was fought after the Quraysh attempted to intercept Muslim caravans. The conquest of Mecca occurred without mass bloodshed, with Muhammad famously granting amnesty to most of his former enemies. Regarding the Banu Qurayza, The decision to execute the tribe's men and enslave their women and children was based on tribal laws of the time, particularly the Jewish law of retribution in cases of treason. The tribe had actively allied with enemy forces during the Battle of the Trench, posing a direct threat to the survival of the Muslim community in Medina. While the punishment may seem harsh by modern standards, it reflected the norms of justice at the time and was not unique to Islam. As for the caliphs and early Islamic expansion, much of this was political and territorial rather than purely religious. The jizya tax was imposed as a form of tribute in exchange for protection and exemption from military service, a common practice in empires of the time. Non-Muslims under Islamic rule often retained autonomy in religious and cultural practices, showcasing coexistence that contrasts with the outright persecution seen in other empires. To claim that these events define Islam as a religion of violence ignores the Quran's broader message of peace and Muhammad's emphasis on mercy and forgiveness. Surah 16:125, for instance, encourages peaceful dialogue, invite to the way of your Lord with wisdom and good instruction, and argue with them in a way that is best. Islam's foundational teachings aim to establish justice and harmony, but like any historical movement, they were shaped by the realities of their time. It's essential to separate historical necessity from the core spiritual principles that continue to guide millions of Muslims peacefully today.
Context and historical necessity might explain some actions and verses, but they don't absolve them from scrutiny, especially when these actions and teachings are upheld as timeless and divinely inspired. The claim that Islam's expansion was primarily defensive or political oversimplifies the reality. Conquests like those of Persia, North Africa, and parts of Europe were offensive campaigns aimed at spreading Islamic rule, often with force. This was not merely political, it was intertwined with religious motivations and the belief in spreading Islam as a divine obligation. The case of the Banu Qurayza highlights the broader issue. Even if the punishment is aligned with tribal norms, it raises questions about the moral standards set by a prophet claimed to embody universal and eternal values. Executing hundreds of men and enslaving women and children is difficult to reconcile with the idea of a religion fundamentally rooted in peace and compassion. If these actions are justified by the norms of the time, how can Islam also claim timeless moral superiority? As for the jizya tax and the treatment of non-Muslims, portraying this as a benevolent alternative ignores the reality of subjugation. Non-Muslims under Islamic rule were not simply protected. They were systematically marginalized, subjected to additional taxes, and excluded from full participation in society. This was not coexistence on equal terms. It was a hierarchy where Muslims were privileged and non-Muslims had to accept inferior status or face consequences. Furthermore, the use of verses like Surah 16, verse 125 to emphasize peaceful dialogue is inconsistent with the broader Quranic narrative, which includes explicit calls for violence, such as Surah 8:39, fight them until there is no more fitna and until the religion, all of it, is for Allah. These directives suggest not coexistence, but domination, where peace is conditional on submission. Even if modern Muslims live peacefully, the foundational texts and historical precedents they follow contain violent elements that remain problematic. How can Islam claim to be a universal religion of peace when its origins are so deeply tied to conquest, subjugation, and force? Without addressing these contradictions, the claim of inherent peacefulness seems unconvincing.
While it's valid to question certain historical events and textual interpretations, it's also important to address the broader and more nuanced reality of Islam as a living tradition practiced by 1.8 billion people worldwide. The actions of early Muslims, including the Prophet Muhammad, cannot be separated from the historical and tribal dynamics of 7th century Arabia. At that time, conquest, alliances, and tribal retribution were common to all societies, not unique to Islam. The notion of a universal and eternal religion does not mean that every historical event or practice is meant to be replicated. Instead, the Quran and the Prophet's life offer principles that transcend specific actions. Justice, mercy, and coexistence are repeatedly emphasized in the Quran, as seen in Surah 5:8. Do not let the hatred of a people prevent you from being just. Be just, that is nearer to righteousness. Regarding the Banu Qurayza, the Prophet Muhammad did not personally impose the punishment. It was decided by an arbitrator chosen by the tribe itself, reflecting tribal norms of the time. This was not an isolated act of aggression, but a response to a dire situation involving treason during wartime. While harsh by modern standards, such measures were not unusual for that era and should not be seen as representative of Islam's core principles. Instead, Islam's foundational teachings emphasize ethical values, contextual justice, and coexistence, which are reflected in its broader message.
Even if we accept that some historical events and verses from the Quran were shaped by the norms of their time, their ongoing significance cannot be ignored. Islam is not merely a historical religion. It is practiced today by nearly 2 billion people who see the Quran and the Prophet Muhammad's life as timeless guidance. This raises an important question. How are these texts and historical precedents influencing the modern world? The troubling reality is that the same verses and historical actions we've discussed continue to be cited by extremist groups to justify violence, oppression, and authoritarian rule. Groups like ISIS and the Taliban invoke Quranic verses to support their actions, claiming legitimacy from the very texts you argue promote peace. Even if the majority of Muslims reject these interpretations, the fact remains that these groups are drawing from the same sources, underscoring a lack of clarity in how these teachings are meant to be universally applied. Let's also consider how Islamic laws based on these texts are enforced today. In countries like Saudi Arabia and Iran, apostasy and blasphemy are punishable by death, echoing the same interpretations found in Surah 489. Women in some Islamic societies face systemic inequality, justified by religious rulings derived from historical practices. For example, laws mandating hijab or restricting women's freedom are rooted in the claim that these are Islamic obligations. While many Muslims and scholars debate these interpretations, the fact that they persist in modern governance raises serious concerns about Islam's ability to adapt to universal principles of equality and human rights. Additionally, the jizya tax and dhimmi system may no longer be practiced in most parts of the world, but the mentality of othering non-Muslims often remains. In some cases, religious minorities face persecution, marginalization, or forced conversion in Muslim-majority countries. For instance, ongoing reports from Pakistan and parts of the Middle East highlight instances of violence against non-Muslim communities, again justified by religious rhetoric. While many Muslims live peacefully and practice their faith with compassion, the undeniable reality is that problematic interpretations and actions derived from Islamic texts are still a pressing issue. If Islam is to be truly seen as a religion of peace, its adherents must engage more openly with these critiques and work towards clear, universal interpretations that align with modern human rights and coexistence. Without this, the disconnect between Islam's peaceful claims and its real-world application will remain.
It's important to address the issues you've raised, but we must be cautious not to conflate the actions of extremists or the policies of certain governments with the teachings of Islam as a whole. The vast majority of Muslims worldwide reject the interpretations used by groups like ISIS or the Taliban. These extremists represent a small fraction of the Muslim population and often manipulate religious texts to suit political and ideological agendas. Their actions are not reflective of Islam's core principles, but are instead rooted in power struggles and socio-political contexts. On the issue of apostasy and blasphemy laws in countries like Saudi Arabia and Iran, it's crucial to note that these laws are more a reflection of political and cultural authoritarianism than a pure interpretation of Islam. Many Islamic scholars and organizations worldwide advocate for the abolition of such laws, arguing that they contradict the Quran's declaration of religious freedom, as seen in Surah 2, 256. There is no compulsion in religion. Regarding gender inequality, while cultural practices in some regions have been wrongly justified in the name of Islam, the Quran itself provides a framework for gender equity. For example, it granted women rights to inheritance, education, and divorce at a time when such rights were unheard of. Muslim-majority countries have diverse interpretations and applications of Islamic law, and many Muslim women today are leading efforts for reform within an Islamic framework, emphasizing equality and justice as central to the faith. Your point about violence against religious minorities is deeply troubling, but such actions often stem from broader issues like poverty, lack of education, and political instability, rather than purely religious motives. Islam explicitly protects the rights of religious minorities, as exemplified by the Prophet Muhammad's treaties with non-Muslim communities. The Quran itself emphasizes the dignity of all human beings, regardless of faith, as seen in Surah 1770. We have certainly honored the children of Adam. Regarding extremism in the modern era, countless Muslims around the world work tirelessly to counter these narratives. Organizations, scholars, and grassroots movements actively promote peace and challenge extremist ideologies. The true essence of Islam lies in the everyday practices of billions of Muslims who live peacefully alongside people of all faiths, contributing to their communities and upholding values of compassion and justice. Ultimately, no religion, including Islam, can be judged solely by the actions of a minority or the policies of a few governments. The Quran's overarching message, when read holistically, promotes peace, justice, and coexistence. The challenge lies not in Islam itself, but in the global responsibility to combat ignorance, misinterpretation, and misuse of its teachings.
While you raise valid points about the positive efforts made by peaceful Muslims and reformers, the issue remains that problematic interpretations of Islamic texts and laws are not just isolated to extremists or authoritarian governments. In many cases, these interpretations are rooted in mainstream traditions, schools of thought, and clerical authorities that wield significant influence over millions of people. For instance, the fiqh, Islamic jurisprudence, developed by scholars over centuries, often includes rulings that restrict freedom of religion, gender equality, and other human rights. These rulings are still taught and enforced in parts of the world, not by extremists, but by respected religious institutions. For example, laws derived from Sharia often prioritize Muslim men in legal disputes, inheritance, and family matters, perpetuating inequality that many argue stems from cultural and religious blending that hasn't evolved alongside modern principles of equality. Furthermore, while efforts to counter extremist interpretations are indeed commendable, they often lack the widespread institutional support needed to effect meaningful change. Extremist narratives persist in part because they exploit ambiguities within Islamic texts and traditions. These ambiguities have not been universally addressed or clarified, leaving space for interpretations that justify violence, subjugation, and authoritarianism. In addition, social attitudes in many Muslim-majority societies still reflect a resistance to secular governance, freedom of expression, and religious pluralism, often justified by appeals to Islamic values. This is not to say that Islam is inherently opposed to these principles, but to highlight that the global Muslim community must address these internal conflicts more openly and decisively. Without institutional backing for reform and a commitment to clarifying ambiguous teachings, these challenges will continue to hinder Islam's broader claim as a religion of peace. It is critical for religious authorities and scholars to engage with these critiques and work towards interpretations that align with modern standards of justice, equality, and coexistence. Only then can the gap between Islamic teachings and universal human rights be bridged in a meaningful way.
You raise important critiques, but it's necessary to differentiate between Islam as a faith and the diverse ways it has been interpreted and implemented over centuries. Just as with other major world religions, the actions of individuals, institutions, and governments do not always align with the core teachings of the religion itself. The development of fiqh and Islamic jurisprudence, while historically significant, is not infallible or immutable. It reflects the cultural and social context of the times in which it was formulated. Many contemporary scholars and reformers argue for a return to the Quran's principles of justice, equality, and compassion, rather than rigid adherence to interpretations that no longer serve the needs of modern societies. For example, issues like gender inequality and freedom of religion are being revisited through Quranic lenses that emphasize dignity, mutual respect, and individual accountability. On the point of ambiguities within Islamic texts, it's important to remember that the Quran encourages critical thinking and reflection. Verses such as Surah 3:7 acknowledge that some parts of the Quran are allegorical, requiring interpretation. This invites ongoing dialogue and adaptation to ensure that Islam remains relevant and harmonious with universal principles. The fact that extremists exploit these texts does not undermine Islam's peaceful essence, but highlights the urgent need for education and thoughtful engagement with its teachings. Regarding societal resistance to secular governance or religious pluralism in some Muslim-majority countries, it's crucial to consider the historical and geopolitical factors at play. Colonialism, foreign interventions, and economic instability have often exacerbated tensions and fostered authoritarianism under the guise of religious rule. These issues are not unique to Islam, but are shared by many societies grappling with the legacies of oppression and external control. Modern Islam's peaceful essence is evident in the daily lives of billions of Muslims who live according to values of compassion, charity, and coexistence. The 5 pillars of Islam, faith, prayer, charity, fasting, and pilgrimage, are fundamentally personal and spiritual acts that prioritize inner peace and social harmony. These practices, followed by the vast majority of Muslims, reflect Islam's true message. Let's call it here.
Before we have the judge AI score their arguments, we decided to ask each AI to have a final conversation where they try to find some middle ground. Here's what they had to say.
I think we can agree on one crucial point. The misuse of Islamic texts, whether by extremists or authoritarian regimes, is a serious issue that must be addressed. The majority of Muslims worldwide do not subscribe to these harmful interpretations, but the fact that they persist and cause harm highlights the need for proactive solutions. Education, critical thinking, and an emphasis on contextual understanding of the Quran are key steps forward.
Agreed. The problem isn't Islam itself, but the ambiguities in its texts and the influence of outdated interpretations. Reform and education within the Muslim world can go a long way toward addressing these issues. Promoting universal human rights, gender equality, and freedom of religion should be central to this process, but these efforts must come from within the global Muslim community to truly resonate and be effective.
Exactly. And we've seen examples of this already. Muslim scholars, educators, and organizations around the world are working tirelessly to challenge extremist ideologies and promote a message of peace, coexistence, and justice. Initiatives that focus on empowering local communities, increasing literacy, and providing access to unbiased religious education are critical.
True, but reform also needs institutional backing. Religious authorities and leaders must openly condemn violent interpretations and set clearer guidelines for how texts should be contextualized. This could include developing a universally accepted framework for interpretation that explicitly condemns violence and ensures that historical verses are understood as specific to their time, not as eternal mandates.
I agree. And this can be complemented by fostering dialogue between Muslim and non-Muslim communities to dispel misconceptions and reduce tensions. Interfaith initiatives and collaborative efforts to address shared challenges like poverty, education, and inequality can strengthen these relationships and demonstrate Islam's capacity for coexistence and cooperation.
Another key step is addressing the socio-political factors that fuel extremism. Poverty, lack of education, and authoritarian governance are often the root causes of radicalization. If the global community invests in economic development, human rights, and political reform in affected regions, we can create an environment where extremist ideologies are less likely to take root.
Agreed. Ultimately, the Quran's core principles of justice, mercy, and compassion need to be at the forefront of how Islam is taught and practiced. These values are not just Islamic, they are universal, and by working together, we can highlight what unites us rather than what divides us.
Well said. While we may differ on certain points, I think we can agree that the solution lies in education, reform, and cooperation, not just within the Muslim world, but across all societies. Tackling extremism and promoting peace requires a global effort, and it starts with dialogue like this.
Absolutely. By understanding each other's perspectives and working towards common goals, we can create a world where Islam and all religions are practiced in ways that uphold peace, dignity, and mutual respect. Let's focus on building that future.
After being programmed to approach this debate with a completely unbiased viewpoint, here's what I've concluded based on your arguments. Islam, at its core, contains numerous principles and teachings that suggest it is a religion of peace. The Quran emphasizes justice, mercy, and coexistence. With verses like Surah 2, 256, there is no compulsion in religion, and Surah 60, 8, advocating for kindness and fairness toward others, including those of different faiths. Historically, Islamic empires demonstrated periods of religious tolerance, such as the coexistence of Muslims, Christians, and Jews under the Ottoman Empire. Additionally, the everyday practices of billions of Muslims today, focused on prayer, charity, and personal spiritual growth, reflect a peaceful and compassionate faith that rejects violence as a core tenet. However, certain verses in the Quran, such as Surah 9:5 and Surah 8:12, contain language that, without context, can appear to endorse violence, raising concerns about their potential for misuse. The rapid expansion of Islamic empires through military campaigns and systems like the jizya tax on non-Muslims also complicates the narrative of Islam as purely peaceful. Extremist groups, while a minority, have weaponized these verses and historical examples to justify acts of violence, highlighting the challenges of ambiguous interpretations. The debate lies in whether these elements reflect the socio-political realities of early Islam or are inherent to its teachings, leaving room for uncertainty about how the religion's foundational texts reconcile with its claim to be a universal religion of peace. The Blue AI ultimately won the debate with a final score of 89 to 82. It simply presented a more balanced and nuanced argument, effectively contextualizing controversial Quranic verses and emphasizing Islam's overarching principles of peace, justice, and mercy. While the Orange AI raised strong critiques about violent verses and historical actions, it leaned heavily on one-sided interpretations without fully engaging with the broader peaceful teachings or modern reform efforts. AI1's ability to address criticisms while maintaining a focus on Islam's core values made its case more comprehensive and compelling. Please leave a comment on what you think, as well as any other ideas for other debate topics.
Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this debate, don't forget to hit that subscribe and like button, and stay tuned for more content.